It's obvious to point out that hairstyles have changed, evolved, or even had inspiration from previous years. You might even see some content creators cosplaying or living their lives through a certain time period or era of fashion, and with that, they style their hair the way that it was back then as well. You might even associate certain styles with groups of people. Some may even judge others with certain types of hair. For example, even in 2024, when I have different colored hair, mostly when it's hot pink, I get some of the biggest side eyes and stares. That brings me to today's topic, the bob haircut. Not the bob we know of today, but back in the early 1900s. Think flapper era, even though some of these bobs did show up a little earlier than the 1920s. It wasn't until I recently came across a post on social media where someone had shared some articles about how bob haircuts were getting blamed for some of the most outrageous things. However, if we look back in time, it would make sense why a woman cutting her hair short caused such a controversy. It wasn't the norm. It was a sign of social rebellion. With all of that being said, let's dive into how bob haircuts caused such a huge uproar and how judgments about hair haven't really changed 100% even in 2024, a little over 100 years later. As I just stated, bob haircuts caused a huge uproar back in the day. I will say that judgment towards hair is still very alive today. If you've been here for a while, you know I've had hot pink hair quite a number of times, and at one point I had a bluish purple. The amount of judgment I receive and continue to receive whenever I change my hair color, both in public and online, is more than anything else in my life. I've had comments left on videos saying things like, of course someone with blue hair would say something like this. Going out in public where I live is always interesting, to say the least, not to mention when I've seen some people discussing how animals turn bright colors to let predators know they are toxic and how the same goes for women. I mention all of this to give an example on how things haven't really changed 100%. It's a little different in present day, but judgment still exists. It's naive to think that judgment won't exist because it most certainly will. However, why was there so much of it when women started sporting bobbed haircuts in the early 1900s? Well, according to one source, quote, "The flapper hairstyle of the 1920s was all about making a political and moral stand. Following the First World War, young women didn't want to return to the traditional female roles in which they were subservient to men. They wanted to be liberated and to have more independence. Dr. Boyington says that the cutting of their long hair, which had been highly prized by previous generations, was seen as a shedding of traditional Victorian female values. This threatened the status quo of the time. Men and older women were affronted and perceived flappers as morally and sexually promiscuous and uncontrollable." End quote. That's the long story short version, but if you're like me and you came across a post on social media about how bobbed haircuts were blamed for so many things, you probably want to learn a little bit more about this topic. And if you don't, that's okay too. But I go down a lot of rabbit holes about the weirdest topics sometimes. But without further ado, let's get into it. You wouldn't think that a haircut would be too big of a deal, right? But when I read one article that stated the bob haircut caused domestic havoc in 1920s America, and in particular fathers were traumatized by the loss of their daughter's hair. This was in part due to, quote, "the cutting of women's hair ate away at the very boundaries that distinguish men from women and women from men," end quote. I haven't been able to find as much information online about this topic as my usual videos, but so far a few sources are pointing towards actress Irene Castle being the one to really popularize the bobbed haircut. Even though Antoine de Paris, who was considered the first celebrity hairdresser, created the bob in the early 1900s based on how artists were portraying Joan of Arc. But back to Irene. She decided to cut her hair before going into surgery to have her appendix removed. Irene Castle was a style icon at the time. Prior to Irene cutting her hair, the style was very long hair that would have to be what they called dressed. Essentially, what this is styling long hair and going from wearing it down to maturing and being able to wear it up or pin back, that sort of thing. One article stated that being able to wear your hair pinned back was almost a rite of passage. If your hair was too long and you needed help styling it like this, you would go to the salon. I had a friend whose grandma always wore her hair up in an older style from this time period. Now, this girl was one of my best friends growing up, but while we lived far away from each other, we would have sleepovers as much as we could. One night, night, I saw her grandma getting ready for bed because she had been living with them, and for the first time ever, I saw her take her hair out of this pin back hairstyle and her hair was past her butt. I couldn't believe my eyes. After that, I could see why she always wore it in a pinned up bun because there was so much of it, and I'm sure there was a lot of hair care involved with that. Anyway, in 1915, Irene Castle had become one of the most popular entertainers after her and her husband had been ballroom dancing together. Women started to copy Irene. Her clothing style was everywhere. Talk about influence. She was an early 20th century style icon. Eventually, Irene would have to take a break from dancing due to having her appendix removed, as I stated earlier, and because she didn't want to have to deal with the upkeep of her hair and style while recovering, which rightfully so, girl, take that break that you need to recover, but she ended up cutting her hair prior to surgery. Once Irene was doing better and ready to go out in public again, she decided hiding her hair was the best bet at the time. She did so by wearing a turban. Then came the night where she went out to dinner with her husband with her short hair for the entire world to see. As you can imagine, within days, women were going to the salon asking for the same hairstyle as Irene. Since short hair was frowned upon at the time, many of these women were actually turned away. One article worded it as, quote, "No respectable ladies' hairdresser would dream of complying with such a shocking request," end quote. With salons turning women away who asked for the castle bob, as they called it, women ended up going to barbershops. And the men were more than willing to cut their hair as short as Irene's. I know that when I've had my heart set on a certain hairstyle, I have achieved it in one way or another. Well, unless if I'm told it will make my hair fall out or something of the sort. But if it's just because someone doesn't really feel like doing it, or it may not be something they know how to do, I'll find someone to do it. Nowadays, I'm sure it's much easier to find someone, and I actually have found the perfect hairstylist. Shout out to my girl Brandy. But now before I get into all of the articles that I came across on social media and was the reason behind wanting to make this video, I wanted to talk about another woman named Marjery Misner. I know in certain industries and professions there are amounts of professionalism that needs to be upheld. When I worked in corporate almost 6 years ago at the time of this recording, I had to look and act the part of your stereotypical corporate employee. I didn't post about my job on social media, mostly because I was doing the social media influencer thing back then, but that was back when I called myself a blogger. However, I still upheld a professional image in case someone did come across my blog from work or even a customer. I didn't want to post anything that could be means for termination. We all know that social media is pretty dominant and people from many industries and professions will be on it. One of those being teachers. I see teachers pop up all the time, whether it's sharing their fashion as a teacher or creating math equations for you to solve in kind of like a riddle, which I think is really interesting. But anyway, I'm sure there are some that post questionable content. In addition, these teachers have lives outside of being a teacher. They have things they like and don't like, and if we bring it back to styles, some people have more of an individual style than others. Well, back in the 1920s, Marjery Misner was one of those types of teachers. She was a first elementary school teacher in Santa Paula. In 1924, the Los Angeles Times described her as a pretty and young teacher. By the end of the year, the district superintendent, Charles D. Jones, of the school she taught at, which was South Grammar School, stated that she was, quote, "an A1 teacher, faithful worker, conscientious, and of good character," end quote. However, even though she was an amazing teacher and was spoken highly about, Charles would also say that she was no longer allowed to teach. And the reasoning? Because she cut her hair into a bob. At the age of 29, a fashionable haircut was the reason this amazing teacher was asked to put in her resignation. I'm not a teacher, nor have I ever worked in a school, so I'm not sure if there's anything in present time that teachers have been asked to put in their resignation for that was kind of like a ridiculous reason, such as a haircut. But apparently there was a rule that the school board did enforce, and that was to not bob your hair. Women who went out and got their hair cut into a bob were not conforming. They wanted to express themselves and went against societal norms. If we bring it back to Marjery and her profession, which was teaching in the 1920s, it wasn't really easy being a teacher, specifically a woman teacher. According to one source, quote, "The average annual salary of a worker in the 1920s was $3,269, but beginning teachers, even in higher paying California, were paid much less, $2,154 for men and $1,760 for for women. According to a history of the Santa Paula schools, minutes of a trustees meeting state that it is understood that all teachers, by accepting the position for the following year, do so cheerfully, and by doing so agree to remain contented during the school year or as long as they are teachers in this school. The trustees set a salary range of $1,600 to $1,900 for the 1923 to 1924 school year. 3 years earlier, 800 teachers formed a union that would become the California Federation of Teachers. During the 1920s, the union would champion a $2,000 minimum annual salary for teachers and object to school boards and school administrators intruding on teachers' personal lives. There were horror stories of teachers getting fired for failing to vote, infrequent church attendance, criticizing a principal or administrator, and wearing the wrong clothing or hairstyles. In an era before collective bargaining, most teachers felt helpless, and only a few, like Misner, were brave enough to challenge school authorities. End quote. I know at the time what Marjery did was a big issue and an example of rebelling, but I admire her for it. As you can probably imagine, when Marjery was fired, as one source said, this caused a howl of protest. Trustees and state school officials received hundreds of letters in defense of Marjery, and Grace Stanley, who was the state commissioner of elementary schools, was asked what a haircut has to do with someone's intelligence or ability to teach. Grace responded by saying that some of the most intelligent teachers in the state have bobbed their hair, but that Marjery was working in Santa Paula for less than a year and was a temporary hire who could be let go at any time. It was also said that had Marjery been a permanent teacher, the process or this situation would be handled differently. Marjery would have had the chance to appear before the board and defend herself. She might not have been let go, but would have gotten in trouble for unprofessional conduct. What I find interesting is that there was a statement Grace made about her own hair being bobbed, and that maybe Marjery should try teaching in a more liberal area where bobbed hair is more accepted. That part is wild to me. So if the state commissioner even had bobbed hair, why was it an issue for Marjery whether or not she was a temp or permanent teacher? This turned into a full-blown controversy. One woman who wrote a letter and signed it Mrs. McLean said that the superintendent of the school belongs back in the Stone Age and how men should stop meddling when it came to what women wear or their hair. Mrs. McLean stated that she was, quote, no flapper or jazz baby, but I am 62 years old and know whereof I speak, end quote. The Stockton Evening and Sunday Record wrote that firing Marjery looked like a case of peeve and arrogance. A bit of sarcasm came from the San Francisco Examiner when they said women should return, quote, to the days of bustles, dragging skirts, high corsets, and leg of mutton sleeves. 3 cheers for Santa Paula and the year 1873, end quote. I'm glad that even some of the media was on Marjery's side. I also love the use of sarcasm because they were right. Fashion and style evolves, and what are these anti-bob haircut people trying to achieve? Marjery's story would be covered by so many more newspapers that included the Fresno Morning Republican, the San Francisco Bulletin, Detroit Free Press, Covington, Kentucky Post and Times Star, the Denver, Colorado Statements, and Windsor Star in Ontario, Canada. Even though a lot of newspapers defended Marjery, the public, specifically men, were kind of divided on the issue. I can see that being the case because even in present day, people don't all agree on issues. If you're wondering what happened to Marjery, she very quickly found a new job. She would end up telling the Los Angeles Evening Citizen News that she was glad she was fired because she ended up getting a better position and her hair not being an issue when she was hired. After all of this happened, the State Department of Education would have to figure out what their next steps would be. Basically, they had to tread lightly. Who knew a haircut would cause this much backlash and attention? The Assistant State Superintendent of Public Instruction, whose name was Sam H. Cohen, did state that bobbed hair was not legal grounds for dismissal. Sam did say that the law doesn't give individual schools schools their own authority to be able to state what teachers should wear or how they should style their hair for both men and women. The Modesto Bee did say if the state board would stand by the decision to not allow bobbed hair, they'd probably have a shortage of teachers, and this was because at least half of the future teachers that had graduated had bobbed hair. I came across a post on Threads titled "A List of Things People Blamed on Bobbed Hair." At first, I thought the post was satire, but then when I looked it up and saw just how controversial bobbed hair was, I knew that it definitely was not satire. I'll go over each article, but let me just tell you, these are some of the most ridiculous things. So the first article that was shared in this post is about a marriage slump. Bobbed hair blamed for marriage slump. London, December 17th, and I actually don't know what year this was written in, but anyway, let's keep going. Cupid is losing business all over the world. Marriages are fewer, but why? According to one rather elderly member of the fashionable set in London's Mayfair, the cause of the bearish market for marriage licenses in the absence of a crowning glory, the disappearance of the golden tresses of Milady, or in a word, bobbed hair. She sees with regret that fewer debutantes than ever before take the wedding veil without a reasonable time from their coming out parties. This, she says, is the fault of barbers who have taken away from modern young ladies that charm which most attracted the opposite sex. To be shingled is to cross the Rubicon, says she. It may convert one from just rather attractive to a positive Delilah or Aphrodite. On the other hand, and more frequently, it may take away whatever beauty one possesses and leave one a physical mediocrity. Then there's another one that says mustaches on women's faces, and that's what bobbed hair is responsible for. Local dermatologists and beauty specialists scoff at the theory made recently by Miss Frances Martle, secretary of the American Cosmetic Society, that the bob promotes mustaches, beards, and hairy patches on young women's faces. Miss Martle asserts the bob should be done away with, as it is destroying feminine beauty. My experience with women, declared a prominent Philadelphia physician, is that if a woman's heart is set on having her hair bobbed, she'll bob it if it kills her. So what's the difference if in 2 or 3 generations women will all be bearded ladies? The lady with long tresses would clip her hair just the same. Scientifically, no amount of bobbing will produce hair where nature did not implant it, skin specialists assert. Cutting the hair strengthens the hair growth on the head, and they say there are even a few cases of bearded ladies, one doctor remarked, but it is utterly improbable and fantastic that 2 or 3 generations to come will see the feminine half of the population utilizing the barber shops except to renew the popular bob. Then it says that bobbed hair was blamed for Kansas says 100 fires were caused by shortened tresses. Kansas is now facing an increase in the insurance rate on residences on account of bobbed hair. E.E. Scott, State Fire Marshal, has declared the accoutrement necessary to keeping bobbed hair presentable has increased the fire hazards in homes. Under the law, this department is required to investigate the cause of every fire that occurs in the state, Scott says. Thus far, in 1924, we have had more than 100 fires caused indirectly from bobbed hair, somewhere in the country, some in cities. Whenever we find a fire caused by an overheated curling iron or the careless handling of curling irons, we know what happened. Women leave the current turned on after they complete the job of waving their hair. The iron is left on dressing table or dresser. The woman goes downtown and returns to find her home has been on fire. Then we have another article, and I can't really make out much of what's in here because of how it was printed, but the title is Amy's Bobbed Hair is Blamed in Temple Rift. The next one is Bobbed Hair is Blamed for Unemployment in Massachusetts. Bobbed hair and its prevailing popularity was blamed for the continued reign of unemployment in this city by Edward J. Driscoll, president of the Chamber of Commerce. Today, when he declared the unemployment situation here was worse now than in January, he said the mania for bobbed locks had greatly decreased the demand for cobs, hairpins, and barrettes, which constitute the chief's industry. Another one, bobbed hair is blamed for $4 tax increase. Then we have bobbed hair blamed by alleged bigamist for all his trouble. Bobbed hair menaces girls with baldness. Conclusions and essays differ. Contest is held on chief obstacles to the Christian religion in America. Bobbed hair is to blame. Bobbed hair was also blamed by many critics for the bankruptcy of the Police Gazette. When women invaded barbershops, the critics say, the barbers took out the Gazette and substituted periodicals they considered more genteel. It is possible to blame almost anything on the women if you put your mind to it. Bobbed hair, cause of uncleanliness, says Fascist Head. This one says Bob blamed for ailment. Bobbed hair is making neurotics of American women. Dr. Edward James Swift, nationally known writer on these psychology subjects, told a Washington University class here on Tuesday. Making constant attempts at rearranging their shorn locks has become a fixed habit with many modern women, Dr. Swift said, explaining that such nervous movements are the beginnings of insidious neurotic tendencies which rapidly lead to cerebus mental disorders. Then there's one that being one of the chief menaces threatening the peace and comfort of our society. So this one was in Omaha, Nebraska. And the article says, bobbed hair is one of the chief menaces threatening the peace and comfort of society, according to James Montgomery Flagg, famous artist. And I'm sure that there were also more articles like this, but that is just what was in that thread. So I will leave a link to that particular post on Threads in case you want to go through it a little bit more. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd make a video about how bobs were blamed for things such as a marriage slump and tax increases, or that a woman would get fired and spark so much outrage and get so much media attention. This topic was fascinating to cover, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And as usual, this is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye!